Hey everyone, Hannah here, and I am doing a video lecture for 446 Summer 2022, Week 2. Alright. So this week we're covering institutions and isms, which will make a little bit more sense, that connection, hopefully in just a second. And I just realized this says Week 1, but we're actually in Week 2. All right, so today, what's on the agenda? I'm going to do Week 1 review, Week 2 lecture, anonymous feedback, and reminders. All right. So just as a reminder, last week, Week 1, we did an overview of classical theory related to sociology and women's studies. This week, I'm going to talk more about intersectionality and competing and overlapping forms of oppression and privilege. So I don't give an overview of that material from Week 1 here, but we will be talking about that more in depth a little bit later on. So just as a reminder, the founding fathers, if you will, the old dead white guys of sociology are Marx, Durkheim, Weber. Marx is most known for his work on conflict theory, which is a critical way of thinking about inequalities between workers and owners and of the exploitation of workers. So thinking about class conflict, especially as it relates to capitalism and the rise of industrialization and capitalism sort of entwining together. Durkheim, most associated with structural functionalism. So he's looking at how do large-scale industrialized urban societies hold together without the bonds of tradition? So again, Durkheim is writing at a time where our society, Western society, is moving into industrialization and capitalism. And so different aspects of our everyday lives, such as family structures, how we earn a living, where we live, was changing very rapidly, and he was concerned with the level of social disorganization that existed as a result. And so he wanted to examine and explain what happens when this type of sort of social chaos happens. And certainly we can think about applying that to a contemporary setting when we think about, are we in a late stage capitalist society or perhaps even a post-capitalist society? And if you think about the social chaos that exists, we had the housing bubble in 2008. COVID has led to a lot of economic issues and things like that. And then finally you have Weber, who was concerned with symbolic interactionism. So he was looking at a lot at bureaucracies and how bureaucracy organizes the world in an industrialized society in a particular way. It's efficient, but it also dehumanizes our everyday interactions and experiences with other members of society. And so, whereas before, you have your farm and your small town rural community, you pretty much know everyone in your surrounding area. But as we grow more urban and more industrialized, it's very possible that you're interacting with members of your society every day and not necessarily knowing their names and who they are and what they do. And that leads to processes of dehumanization. And that becomes particularly important as we start to think about isms and so structural inequalities. It's very easy to have systemic racism and sexism and other isms when we have for so long dehumanized other people within our society. So people we might be engaging with, but not necessarily knowing on a personal level, right? Okay. Now, in sociology and women's and gender studies, we have some overarching paradigms we often use to think about the world around us. So in addition to these theories and these theorists, we can also think about these sort of dichotomies. So the first one is material and culture. In our societies, in all societies, we have things: clothing, food, songs, stories. These are all things that are a part of our culture and our society. Now we have the material objects, right? The tangible things that exist in our society. And that's one aspect. But we can also think about the cultural meanings of these things. So if you think about food as an example, well, food is a physical thing and you need it to survive, right? But think about the cultural significance of certain types of food, right? And so if you think about a lot of countries will have a national dish. And so, yes, that is a food item and it's a physical thing, but people who are part of that country are going to take national pride in that dish in a way that someone from another country is not going to understand or necessarily share. If we think about living here in Hawaii, there's a lot of Hawaiian foods that I enjoy and I love to eat, like lau lau or poi, but I'm familiar with the cultural significance of some of those foods, but it's not a part of my culture as a haole from the mainland. And so the cultural significance of those food items is going to be different for me, right? And perhaps you can think about some different material goods within our society that perhaps have a cultural significance that's unique to you based off of your experiences and your cultural identity. Moving right along, we have structure and agency. So in our society, we like to think that we have a lot of agency and we're making choices about our lives, things about what type of jobs we have, the education we hope to obtain. We think about these things, the type of car we drive, the type of clothes we wear, the food we like, as personal agency and choices we make. But in reality, there are larger social structures and forces at play, right? So I was born female, and I identify as a woman. Based off of that, I like certain clothing. I like makeup. I like to have long hair. Those are pretty stereotypical feminized things in Western society, and in particular in the United States. So I like to think I have agency in choosing those preferences, but in reality, in those examples, those are structural forces based off of gender and perhaps some sexism, right, in our society. All right, and then micro and macro. So within our society, and I'll say micro, macro, that dichotomy is probably the most intuitive for most students. And so micro, we're thinking about small scale, everyday interactions that we experience in our lives. And then macro analysis is looking at some of these larger social institutions and structural forces at play. And you can start to see how these different paradigms overlap and interact with each other. But when we start to think about social problems and social issues, some of the different weekly topics we're covering in this class, we can hone in on specific dichotomies for analysis purposes. And so think about applying some of these things to some topics that you cover in your weekly discussion board posts. You might also apply these paradigms to topics you cover in your discussion leader projects as well. All right, and then finally, race, class, and gender. Now, increasingly, this idea of analyzing social issues based off of identities like race, class, and gender, what we might refer to, especially in women's and gender studies spaces, as intersectionality, it's increasingly being used in the sociological canon, but really it's an overarching theme that is rooted in and founded in women and gender studies, the field of women's and gender studies. Now, if we think about this paradigm, we're constantly thinking about aspects of identities and how they impact social institutions and social forces, as well as more micro-scale things like our everyday lived experiences. And certainly we can add other identities. We also want to be thinking about the ways in which privilege and oppression and marginalization operate in our everyday lived experiences, as well as on that more macro scale and in social institutions. Okay, additional key terms. What is a social institution? So one of my little soapbox things about the field of sociology is that we don't always do a great job of defining foundational terms. We just operate under the assumption that everyone's going to know what a social institution is. And I think that's probably true to a certain extent, especially if you ask everyday lay audiences to provide examples of social institutions. But defining this term is important, and we should do that. So I define social institution as a social structure or mechanism that organizes our everyday lives. these are sort of big things that we can't really change as individuals. So some examples, sort of classic examples we often discuss and analyze in sociology are things like family, education, politics, religion. Now, sometimes my students will say, I want to play the devil's advocate. I don't think education organizes my life. I'm a senior, I'm graduating from UH at the end of this semester, and I'm never going to go back to school again. I don't want to have kids, so I'm not going to have to send my kids to school. Education's never going to organize my life again. But to that, I would say, not true. Have you ever lived in Makiki and gotten stuck in early rush hour traffic because Punahou and all those private schools in that area are so backed up with the parent pickup line that you are 2 seconds away, less than a mile away from your home, and yet you're stuck in gridlock traffic because of when school lets out, right? So maybe you have to plan what time you leave work or what time you leave to go into your office based off of a school in your neighborhood, right? And so education is still going to organize our everyday lives because we're members of society, and it's a larger social structure, a social institution in our contemporary Western society. Now, we're talking about total institutions this week as well. This is a term coined by Erving Goffman, who is sort of on the cusp of classic and contemporary sociological thought. He wrote a book called Asylums, where he looked at psychiatric wards and how folks who are admitted to psychiatric wards, every single aspect of their lives, from when they eat, who they see, where they're physically allowed to be at the hospital, is all heavily regulated by this total institution. And so that's kind of the classic example of a total institution. But there are some other really great examples, or sort of classic examples at this point in our society. So if you think about institutions of higher education, and especially ones where the majority of students live on campus, so that's not necessarily the case at the University of Hawaii, but if you think about UC Berkeley or Harvard, some of these residential campuses where sometimes up to 90-95% of the student population lives on campus, either in a student apartment complex or in the dormitories. Every aspect about their everyday social interactions is regulated by the university. Where they eat, when they take their classes, when they're able to work, if they even work. All these things are being influenced heavily and regulated heavily by higher education. Some other examples would be prison. So if you're incarcerated, then certainly prison is a total institution that regulates every aspect of your life. And that's one of the total institutions we'll discuss more in detail later on in our semester. And then finally, the military, which we won't talk about as much in this class, but certainly we can make connections to the military in terms of structural violence and gender-based violence. And then we can also think, it's pretty easy to determine how the military and the different branches of the military are total institutions. And if you're interested in sort of some of that structural violence as it relates to gender-based violence, there is a documentary it used to be on Netflix, I think it's still on Netflix, called The Invisible War. And it takes a critical lens looking at gender-based violence, and specifically gender harassment, sexual assault, and rape in the military. So I do want to add a trigger warning if you do choose to watch that documentary, but they actually talk to people who have different experiences with gender-based violence within the military. And so they're not just talking to experts in the field and professors and researchers, they're actually talking to people who have served in the armed forces and what that structural violence looks like. All right. So we know, and I've started to talk about some of the ways in which structural violence can play out in social institutions. But what does that mean? Or what is systemic racism, systemic sexism, what does that actually mean? Because I see increasingly in sort of lay audience spaces, like social media, for example, people talk about systemic racism a lot, but they don't always define it, and perhaps the people sharing these posts don't even know how to. So let's make sure we can do that. So systemic means it's fundamental and deeply rooted into social structures, into the social fabric of our everyday lives. So when something is systemic, like systemic racism, it means we can't think about, let's use the carceral state and the prison industrial complex and being incarcerated. We can't think about prison as a social institution or a total institution without thinking about the systemic racism that exists. And so if we think on the mainland about the very deep rooted connection between the prison system and slavery and the Jim Crow era, you cannot think about the contemporary prison state without thinking about those other issues. Or here in Hawaii, you cannot think about the prisons here without thinking about the racism that exists because of the plantations. And you can't think about the prison situation here without also thinking about colonialism and settler colonialism, and who's disproportionately incarcerated here in Hawaii, which of course we know is Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, right? So there's racism, there's sexism, there's ableism, there's all these isms, and there are systemic ways in which violence plays out in social institutions in our society. And again, just as a reminder, I said we'd review intersectionality. This term is just the interconnectedness of systems of oppression, looking at race, class, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, ableism, sizeism, and other aspects of identities to answer questions about how these forms of privilege and oppression overlap and intersect in our everyday lived experiences as members of our society, as well as within social institutions like family, education, politics, and religion, so forth. All right, now that I finished talking about these really heady things, be sure to do your exit pass for the week. It's linked here if you've been following along with the PowerPoint slides, and I'll also provide a link on LaLima. Don't forget, if you haven't already, read Unpacking White Privilege by Peggy McIntosh. You also have an excerpt from Erving Goffman that covers total institutions more in depth. You need to respond to discussion board 2. I believe there's 2 prompts to choose from, so you can sort of pick and choose which one you like better. Response of one classmate, either do a traditional response or create a meme. Your reflection paper is due this week on Friday at 11:55 p.m. Don't forget, you can always check the last page of our syllabus. I have a schedule with all the due dates on there that goes over stuff like the reflection paper. You got your rubric for that assignment on LaLima, and then discussion leader projects start next week. That means if you signed up for week 3, your discussion leader project is actually due this Friday at 11:55 p.m. And just as a reminder, if you go to our LaLima page, I'll go into student view. So this is what week 2 looks like. After this video is complete, it'll go here. And if you go down to weekly assignments, you can submit your reflection paper here. You can learn more about Discussion Leader Project here. Or you can also go to resources, go to rubrics, click on the reflection paper folder. Here's the rubric for the reflection paper. Here's an overview of how to organize your reflection paper using the 5-paragraph essay model. What else? If you go back to rubrics, go to project docs. Here's a rubric for Discussion Leader Project. Here's a tutorial video I created covering all the different aspects of the Discussion Leader Project and providing greater detail regarding that rubric. And then if you're looking for an example that a student has submitted for a discussion leader project to me in previous semesters, you can look at this here. To submit your reflection paper, you can go to assignments, go to reflection paper and submit that here. And then remember, for discussion leader projects, that's a little bit different. So for that, you'll want to go to 446 Summer 2022 Student Projects. This is a folder where all of the discussion leader projects will be housed. Go to your week, go to new, go to file upload, and then find your PowerPoint and any additional material you might have for your discussion leader project and upload that here. And if you don't remember what week you signed up for, or maybe you didn't sign up for a week and so I signed you up myself, you can always go to student sign up, that folder, click on discussion leader, and it'll take you to this spreadsheet with the weeks, people's names, email. If you've signed up for the same week as another student, which I believe there should be 2 students signed up for each week, you will want to coordinate with that person so you can find their email here. All right, that's all I got for you. Have a great week. Bye, everyone.